There was a half-naked man fishing off my private dock and grilling sausages like it was his personal resort patio, and when I told him to get off my property, he grinned and said Karen gave it to him as a gift. I stood there blinking like someone had just handed me a pineapple and called it a lawsuit. His folding chair was nailed into the dock plank. His cooler had a label that read Dock Commander. And that smell I thought was lake water was actually bratwurst sizzling over a camp stove that he'd duct-taped to my wood rail. I didn't know whether to scream, laugh, or just push the whole dock into the lake with him still on it. But I should have known this was no random madness. This was Karen. HOA Karen. And she had just declared war. It had started innocently enough. I'd taken a weekend trip to the nearby hills, a tech-free getaway for some peace and kayaking with friends. I returned early Monday morning, groggy and sunburned, expecting nothing more than a hot shower and some emails. Instead, I found a crusty old guy in cargo shorts occupying the far end of my dock with the posture of a Roman emperor. His fishing line was sloppily cast into the water, bobbing without bait, and his sandals were off, resting on a cooler that was clearly plugged into something I didn't recognize. He looked at me like I was the intruder. I asked if he was lost, or maybe waiting for someone. He squinted at me like I was speaking in Morse code, then jabbed a thumb toward Karen's property. He said, and I quote, "I'm Bert, Karen's uncle. She said this dock was community property now, and I'm welcome anytime." I laughed once. Just once. Because in my head, it didn't register as reality. Who says something that absurd with such confidence unless they believe they're above consequences? Bert wasn't just lounging. He was settling in. He'd hung wind chimes from the pergola at the end of the dock. A battery-powered fan was oscillating beside him. He had even laid out a tacky mat that said home is where the anchor dropped. I stared in disbelief as he flipped his bratwurst and asked me if I had any mustard. The sheer absurdity made me question my sanity. I stormed over to Karen's place. Her property butted up next to mine, though she'd somehow convinced the HOA to build a row of shrubs last year to separate our spaces more dramatically. She was hosting some sort of backyard champagne brunch with other HOA board members, most of whom looked as stiff as folded ironing boards. Karen wore her signature sun hat and that smug expression she reserved for times when she believed she'd just pulled off something brilliant. I asked her what her uncle was doing on my dock. She laughed like it was a sitcom. "Oh Tyler, you didn't read the new HOA clause. We restructured the lakefront access. The dock edges past your parcel lines, so technically it's communal now." I asked her if she had a legal document that said that. She held up a single laminated sheet with a fake emblem and her signature in big looping letters under the words Lakeside Shared Resource Authorization. It looked like something she printed off Canva in a rush. I told her flatly that the dock was built with private permits, that I had records from the county zoning office, and that this was clear trespassing. She replied, "That's your opinion. Bert's a guest and he's part of this community. You should be more neighborly." She sipped her mimosa like she hadn't just thrown a Molotov cocktail at property rights. I didn't argue further. I knew Karen. Arguing was fuel for her fire. She thrived on confrontation if she was the one making the rules. But this time, I wasn't going to play defense. I returned home, pulled out every file from the cabinet under my desk, and started scanning in permits, blueprints, payment receipts for the dock build, and even the stamped letter from the county confirming the dock's final inspection approval. Everything was airtight. It wasn't even a gray area. But Karen wasn't interested in facts. She wanted control. That night, I watched from my upstairs window as Bert unfolded a lantern and sat on the dock like a king in exile. I could see him scrolling on his phone and singing off-key to some 80s classic. My blood boiled, but not with rage. It was something else. Anticipation. Because I wasn't going to yell anymore. I was going to do something better. You see, I'm not just some lakeside homeowner. I work in custom marine transport. My job involves moving everything from pontoons to floating cabins across long distances without damage. I know how to secure, lift, and tow structures that most people would assume are immovable. Including dock. Including mine. Especially mine. Because when I built it, I installed modular brackets and a detachable anchoring system. Karen had no idea the dock was designed to move. By morning, I already had a plan. I called my old Marine crew, guys who owed me favors, including one who once moved a floating wedding venue across 3 states. I explained the situation, and to my surprise, they didn't even ask for payment. One of them just said, "You mean HOA Karen? We've seen her on Reddit. Say no more." The next day, I visited the HOA meeting to raise a concern. Karen wasn't there, but her vice president Harold was. Harold had the charisma of a beanbag and the backbone of cooked spaghetti, but he couldn't deny me the 5-minute public floor speech. I handed him a folder titled Unauthorized Dock Usage and Boundary Theft. In that folder were maps, GPS-verified photos, county letters, and a notarized statement from the original dock contractor. Harold started sweating before I finished my 3rd sentence. After the meeting, a few HOA members privately approached me. One of them, Sharon, whispered that Karen had never filed a zoning change. Another said she had a private WhatsApp group where she cooked up most of her power plays. I thanked them but said I had it handled, because by that time, my crew had already arrived. We parked the barge and equipment out of sight at a neighboring inlet. Bert, still blissfully unaware, had now added a camp chair and a fishing net to his throne setup. He had turned my dock into a retirement home lounge. My crew and I waited for the perfect time. The cables were ready. The anchor brackets were pre-loosened. The weather forecast showed calm conditions for the next 48 hours. We were greenlit. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt an almost wicked kind of satisfaction. This wasn't just payback. This was about showing Karen and every overreaching control freak that people notice when lines are crossed. Especially property lines. And I was about to tow my dock with a stowaway passenger named Bert. He just didn't know it yet. But by sunrise tomorrow, the whole lake would. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was worried about what I was about to do, but because the anticipation buzzed through me like electricity. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined Bert drifting slowly into the open lake, sitting on my dock like it was a cruise ship, and calling Karen in a panic. I wasn't usually a petty person. I didn't enjoy revenge for its own sake. But this wasn't just about me anymore. Karen had made it about power, about disrespect, about rewriting reality because she thought she could. And if nobody put a stop to it now, it wouldn't be just my dock next time. It would be my shed, my garage, or even my house. People like Karen only stopped when they hit a wall hard enough to leave a dent. The next morning, I dressed like it was a normal day. Coffee, jog, pretend emails. I didn't want to alert anyone. Bert was still on the dock. By 9 a.m., he had added a small umbrella and placed a speaker on the edge playing yacht rock from the 70s. He waved to someone on a kayak and offered them beer. I watched from behind my blinds as he lit another sausage on his portable grill. Then I got the signal. My crew had docked the barge at the hidden inlet and were ready. They were experienced, quiet, and efficient. We weren't going to make a scene. We were going to make history. The operation started with the anchor cables. Because I had designed the dock with transport in mind, all it took was 4 points of contact and hydraulic releases that could be triggered manually. We disguised the barge's approach with a local fishing permit and even brought rods in case someone asked what we were doing. Nobody did. The lake was quiet that day, except for Bert singing along to something that sounded like he thought he was Billy Joel. As the final latch loosened and the support ropes took tension, I felt a rush of thrill I hadn't experienced since my first big transport job years ago. The dock groaned slightly, not enough to alert Bert, but just enough to remind me this thing was real. We timed it so the pull was gradual, natural-looking. The wind helped. By 10:30 a.m., the dock had drifted 12 feet from shore. Bert didn't even notice. He was too busy arguing with someone over speakerphone, probably Karen, about the best brand of fishing tackle. By 11 a.m., the dock was nearly 25 feet out. That's when Bert noticed the shoreline moving. He stood, wobbled, and yelled something like, "Hey, what the hell is this?" His chair tipped. His speaker fell. He rushed to grab his cooler as it started sliding toward the edge. I watched with binoculars from my porch, sipping lemonade. This was better than reality TV. Karen burst onto her lawn like someone had set off an alarm in her brain. She was barefoot, in a robe, waving her phone in the air like a sword. Her yelling reached across the water. Bert was shouting too, flapping his arms like a marooned sailor. One of my crew members, Carl, waved politely from the barge as if he were just adjusting a fishing net. The dock continued to drift, tethered by the barge now gently pulling it toward a predetermined spot about 200 feet down the shoreline, well within my property's extended lake permit zone. Legally, it was still mine. Just no longer where Karen wanted it. The sheriff's boat arrived around noon. Apparently Karen had called them in a hysterical panic, claiming a kidnapping or maritime theft. I had already emailed the sheriff's office earlier that morning with all my documentation, just in case. The two officers looked confused when they saw a man sitting on a floating dock eating sausage and yelling into his phone. When they pulled up to Bert, he pointed back at my house and screamed that I had hijacked him. One officer asked if he was being held against his will. Bert paused, then muttered, "No, but he's being a damn jerk about it." The officers turned the boat toward me. I met them on my shoreline, smiling, binder in hand. They reviewed every permit, photo, legal doc, timestamp, and correspondence I had neatly laid out. One of them, Deputy Lawson, smirked when he saw Karen's fake permit from the HOA with her signature in gold marker. The officers said they couldn't find any wrongdoing on my part and told Karen, who had now stormed over in full dramatic meltdown mode, that this was a civil matter at best. Karen, red-faced and gasping like a fish on land, yelled that I had to put the dock back or face consequences. I calmly replied that I was simply repositioning my property within my authorized zone, which was completely within my rights. If her uncle had mistakenly assumed he owned it, that was unfortunate but not my problem. One officer actually laughed. That seemed to enrage Karen more than anything. Bert was brought back by the sheriff's boat, grumbling and soaked from a wave splash. He looked humiliated, clutching his cooler like it was a child. Karen tried to comfort him, then turned to yell at the officers again, demanding I be arrested. They told her that unless she had documentation disproving mine, she was wasting their time. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip and the lake turned orange, I sat out on my new shoreline and watched Karen pacing furiously up and down her lawn. Bert was no longer visible. The dock now sat peacefully where I'd intended, tethered and locked to new moorings I'd installed earlier. It looked perfect. More importantly, it looked untouchable. I received 3 emails from HOA members that night. 2 apologized for not standing up to Karen sooner. One admitted he'd always hated her fake leadership and asked if I would consider running for the next board president vote. I ignored them all for now. My victory wasn't political. It was personal. I didn't need to run the HOA. I just needed them to understand that there were limits, and if they didn't respect boundaries, I would show them exactly how mobile those boundaries could become. What I didn't know then was that Karen wasn't done. She wasn't someone who let go. She was already plotting, already scheming, already whispering to her circle. But what she didn't understand yet was this wasn't a game anymore. She had made it legal, and legal was a terrain I had studied, documented, and mastered. The next time she tried something, it wouldn't just be her reputation at stake. It would be her position, her money, and possibly her freedom. Because now I had more than a dock. I had the law on my side. And next time I wouldn't tow. I'd sue. By the next morning, things felt eerily calm, like the eye of a storm had settled over the lake. The dock sat in its new location, floating peacefully, tethered to the side of my property like it had always belonged there. Bert was nowhere in sight. I assumed he had slinked back into Karen's house after the embarrassing showdown with the sheriff's Marine unit. And Karen herself? Silent. That silence didn't comfort me. If there was one thing I had learned living next to Karen, it was that silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Still, I allowed myself to enjoy the win. That morning, I brewed fresh coffee and sat on the patio, watching the dock gently bob in the water. I had already reinforced the new mooring lines and added a few reflective buoys for visibility. The lake shimmered, tranquil and undisturbed, like it was on my side for once. I chuckled, thinking about the headlines that could have come from this whole episode. Man tows trespasser mid-fishing trip. Or HOA tyrant defeated by floating platform. It was surreal, but I wasn't foolish enough to believe it was over. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. She was the type to find a new battlefield. Sure enough, just before noon, I spotted her pacing along the edge of her property with a clipboard in one hand and a walkie-talkie in the other. She was muttering to herself, squinting at my dock like it had personally insulted her. I didn't react. I just watched. Karen then marched to the edge of her own shoreline, pulled out her phone, and began snapping pictures of the dock from every angle like she was building a case. I had no doubt she'd already emailed every local department she could think of, but I also had no doubt that none of them would back her. My permits were airtight. The placement legal. The sheriff's office had already dismissed her complaint. She had nothing. Except that wasn't quite true. What Karen had was spite. And spite, I was learning, could be more dangerous than logic. That afternoon, I got a visit from the local lake safety board. Two older gentlemen in tan polo shirts with badges that looked more like promotional keychains. They introduced themselves politely, said they were doing a routine survey of dock placements. I offered them iced tea. They declined. One of them, a balding man named Gerald, asked to inspect the new moorings. I obliged, even handed him a laminated copy of my updated permit. His partner, a quieter man with a sunburnt nose, flipped through the documents and nodded at every line. After about 10 minutes, they both admitted everything was perfectly legal. I asked if Karen had called them. Gerald didn't answer directly, but gave me a look that said everything I needed to know. She wasn't done. She was just escalating. Around 3 p.m., I noticed Bert had returned. He stood awkwardly at the edge of Karen's lawn, squinting at the dock like it might bite him. His folding chair was gone. His swagger too. This version of Bert looked like someone who had been yelled at by too many people in too short a time. He called out to me across the water, voice hesitant. He asked if he could come grab the cooler he'd left behind. I told him it was already on my porch. I hadn't thrown it out, though I'd considered it. He shuffled over slowly, keeping his eyes down. When he got close, he said something unexpected. He apologized. It was mumbled and reluctant, but it was there. He said Karen told him the dock was shared and he didn't think to question it. He admitted she made it sound official, like it had been approved. I told him I understood, but added that ignorance didn't make it right. I handed him the cooler. He thanked me and didn't say another word. Just walked back across the lawn like a man who'd seen too much sun and too little truth. It would have been a quiet end, but of course, Karen appeared at that exact moment. She snapped at Bert for talking to me and told him to get inside. He didn't argue. He just nodded and disappeared into her house. I assumed that was the end of it for the day. I even began grilling on my patio, planning to enjoy the peaceful night. But then, just as the first burger hit the grill, I heard the unmistakable sound of Karen's voice echoing across the lake. She had pulled out a portable bullhorn. I froze, spatula in hand. She shouted that I was harboring unsafe construction on a communal waterway, and that the HOA had voted unanimously to demand the dock be removed by sunrise or face enforcement. I laughed so hard I almost dropped the burger. Karen was bluffing. There was no enforcement authority in the HOA bylaws. An unanimous vote? I knew for a fact several members had turned on her. But that wasn't the goal. She wasn't trying to win legally. She was trying to win loudly. I turned on my patio speakers, played classical music at a respectable volume, and raised a glass to her from across the yard. She shouted something I couldn't quite hear over the violins. I took that as another victory. The next morning, a large white envelope was taped to my door. Inside was a cease and desist letter printed on HOA letterhead, with Karen's signature and an obviously fabricated legal reference to shoreline safety violations. I laughed again, snapped a picture, and forwarded it to my lawyer. He called me 5 minutes later laughing harder than I was. He told me to keep everything she sent. It might come in handy if this turned litigious. I said I was hoping it would. That evening, I received a surprise visit from 2 HOA board members, Sharon and Dennis. Both looked tired, like they hadn't had a good night's sleep since this feud started. They admitted they didn't support Karen's latest stunt. Sharon confessed that Karen had faked the vote, forged signatures, and even edited minutes from the last meeting to make it seem like everyone had agreed. Dennis added that half the board was planning a vote to remove her as president. They just needed evidence. I handed them copies of the cease and desist letter, the fake permit, the video of the dock incident, and a flash drive with Karen's entire meltdown from the sheriff's visit. Their faces lit up. Later that night, I sat on the dock again, under string lights I'd just installed, feet in the water, breeze in my face. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the lake was mine again. Not just the property, but the peace. Karen had tried everything short of legal sabotage. But every time she swung, I was ready. Every document, every clip, every witness. She thought power came from being loud. But real power came from being right and from being ready. I knew the final battle was near. She wasn't going to stop until she either broke me or lost everything. And I wasn't going to let her break anything but her own illusion of control. One way or another, this dock wasn't going anywhere. But I had a feeling Karen's presidency was. And when it fell, it was going to make a splash even bigger than the one Bert made when the dock started drifting. The storm finally broke at the next HOA meeting. For once, I didn't need to say a word. I just sat quietly in the corner with my binder in my lap while Karen stood at the front, arms crossed, trying to reassert her authority like the dock fiasco had never happened. She opened with a speech about preserving community integrity and upholding standards, but the room wasn't buying it. You could feel the shift. The same people who used to nod politely now looked away. Some even shook their heads outright. The incident with the dock had spread like wildfire, not just through the neighborhood but online, thanks to someone anonymously uploading footage of Bert being towed into the lake. It went viral under the title Floating Freeloader, HOA Edition. The comments were brutal. Karen had become a meme, and worse, she knew it. Sharon, the board secretary, was the first to stand up. She cleared her throat, voice steady, and said they had serious concerns about forged documents and misrepresented vote. Dennis followed, dropping a folder on the table filled with comparisons of the meeting minutes from Karen's fake document and the real one he had saved separately. The discrepancy was undeniable. Karen started to interrupt, but she was cut off, something that had never happened before. Another board member, an elderly man named Harold who rarely spoke unless it involved fertilizer ordinances, stood up and simply said, "We've had enough, Karen." That one sentence felt like the sound of a hammer slamming down in a courtroom. Karen tried to shift the blame. She pointed at me and said I was waging a personal vendetta. She said I had manipulated the HOA and embarrassed her uncle publicly. But then Bert, sitting sheepishly near the back, raised his hand. He admitted in front of everyone that he had no idea the dock wasn't communal and that Karen had told him it was fine to use it. He said he never wanted any of this to happen and that the whole lake incident was probably on him for trusting bad information. It was a moment that sucked the air right out of the room. Karen's last potential defense collapsed under the weight of her own blood relative's confession. The board called an emergency vote to remove her from the presidency. The results weren't even close. 9 in favor, 1 against, hers. Karen's face went slack. It was the first time I had seen her speechless. She mumbled something about legal representation and stormed out of the room without collecting her things. The rest of us sat in silence for a moment, then Sharon stood again and announced a temporary board reorganization. She looked at me and asked if I'd consider joining the HOA as a property liaison. I smiled, thanked her, and said I'd think about it. The truth was, I didn't want to govern. I just wanted peace. But peace wasn't done with Karen yet. Less than a week after she was ousted, I received a notice of a small claims suit filed by Bert. Or rather, filed by Karen on behalf of Bert. The claim? Emotional distress, public humiliation, unauthorized transport of personal property, and loss of recreational enjoyment. The document read like a comedy sketch, but the court date was real. I had 2 weeks to prepare. My lawyer, a calm woman named Elise with the deadpan delivery of a stand-up comic, barely blinked as she read the papers. She sipped her coffee, flipped through the pages and said, "This is going to be fun." We compiled everything. The video of Bert on the dock, relaxing and grilling. The footage of him waving to passing boat. The recording of his conversation with the sheriff saying he wasn't being held against his will. And my entire permit folder, now backed up digitally and in triplicate. Elise called it the most unnecessary case she'd ever been excited to destroy. The court date arrived and the room felt like a community theater show. Karen walked in dressed like she was auditioning for a legal drama, clipboard in hand, eyes darting nervously. Bert looked like he regretted agreeing to any of it but didn't have the guts to back out. Elise laid out the facts in her opening statement so plainly the judge actually smiled. She didn't even bother being dramatic, just logical, thorough, and calm. Karen, acting as Bert's advisor, interrupted twice and was warned by the judge to remain seated. When Elise played the video of Bert offering beer to a kayaker from the middle of the lake while singing along to a portable radio, the courtroom erupted in laughter. The judge had to bang the gavel twice. By the time we got to the GPS data showing the dock was never outside my property zone, and a brief witness testimony from Deputy Lawson confirming no laws were broken, the case was essentially over. The judge ruled in my favor immediately, stating that not only was there no merit to the claim, but the evidence showed the plaintiff participated in the events willingly. He added that misuse of the court system for personal vendettas would not be tolerated. Karen stormed out mid-sentence. With that, Karen's last stand collapsed. Word spread through the neighborhood within hours. A few neighbors stopped by my place to congratulate me. Sharon and Dennis brought a small cake that said "Long live the dock." Even Bert, surprisingly, showed up later that week to apologize again. This time, more sincerely. He said Karen had pushed him into it, promised it would all work out, and that she was now blaming him for everything. I told him to take care of himself, and reminded him that next time someone gives you something that isn't theirs, maybe check before nailing a folding chair to it. By now, the dock had become something of a symbol. People started calling it the Freedom Dock. A couple of kayakers even asked to take photos with it. I added a few fun touches. A floating mailbox that read "No Karen Mail," a tiny flag that said "Mine Legally," and a weatherproof speaker that played calming ocean sound. I wasn't trying to rub it in. I was just leaning into the absurdity that had taken over my life, and finding a way to laugh through it. Karen, meanwhile, packed up and left the neighborhood. Her house went on the market with a price /2 weeks later. Rumors swirled that she had moved 2 towns over and was already clashing with another HOA about solar panels and mailbox colors. Some people never change. But here, peace returned. The new HOA board focused on actual community issues. The lake became less political and more fun again. The dock? Still floating, still mine, and more popular than ever. I sat on it one evening, watching the sun dip low and the sky turn soft and orange. I thought about everything that had happened, the chaos, the scheming, the weird sausage grilling in the middle of a lake. And I realized something. Karen hadn't just tried to steal a dock. She had tried to steal space, power, control. But what she didn't understand was that you can't own what isn't yours. And you can't push people forever without pushback. Eventually, they float away. Or they float you away, whether you're ready or not. It was strange how quickly things settled after Karen left. One day, her house was a monument to passive-aggressive HOA dictatorship, flags warning about lawn length, a bulletin board of reminders nailed to the fence, and the next, it stood empty, the blinds drawn like tired eyelids. No more bullhorn announcements. No more fake permit. No more uninvited relatives claiming sunbathing rights on private property. Just a vacant shell with a crooked for sale sign that rattled whenever the wind blew across the lake. People had grown quiet about it, but not out of fear, out of relief. It was like the neighborhood had been holding its breath for years and finally exhaled. The new HOA board made good on their promise to do better. Sharon, now acting president, started every meeting with a public transparency section where anyone could raise concerns without needing a form in triplicate or Karen's blessing. Dennis began working on new bylaws that would prevent a single person from ever wielding unchecked authority again. And me? I politely declined every invitation to join the board. I told them I was better off on the sidelines, dockside, where the sun was warm and the view was better. I used the settlement money from Karen's failed lawsuit, plus a small bonus gifted to me by grateful neighbors, to upgrade the dock into something special. It was no longer just a platform with a few planks and a mooring rope. I added weatherproof seating, solar lights along the rails, and a small floating fire pit at the end for night gatherings. I even installed a retractable canopy that could deploy with the press of a button. The dock had been built to move, and ironically, after all that drama, it had finally become a place to stay still. A place people actually respected. The first gearing happened quietly. Sharon brought her husband. Dennis showed up with lemonade and a Bluetooth speaker. A few neighbors brought snacks. No one made a big speech. We just floated slightly, feet dipping in the water, laughter bouncing off the lake like sunlight on ripples. For the first time in years, we weren't arguing about boundary lines or overgrown hedges. We were just people, neighbors, enjoying something simple and earned. I remember thinking how ridiculous it all seemed. That something as small as a dock could trigger such a storm, and yet, here we were, still floating, and the only thing unsteady was the laughter when someone's cup tipped overboard. A week later, I woke up to find a small package at my doorstep. Inside was a framed photo, taken from the sheriff's boat, apparently, of Bert sitting mid-lake, arms folded, lips pursed, cooler by his side. Beneath it was a printed label that read "Drift happens." No return address. Just a moment frozen in time and immortalized by someone with a wicked sense of humor. I hung it in my garage, next to the original dock blueprint. A reminder. Not just of what happened, but of how far things had gone just because someone refused to hear the word no. Karen, it turned out, didn't disappear completely. A month after she moved, a new family moved into her old home, and the husband confided that she'd tried to get their realtor banned from her new HOA because he wore a short-sleeved shirt to a meeting. It wasn't even a collared shirt offense, just sunburned arms, apparently, that offended her sensibilities. Some people really never learn. But here, her name became a kind of warning. A verb, even. If someone tried to overstep or start something petty, you'd hear someone mutter, "Don't go full Karen." The joke landed every time. Still, not everything about the aftermath was funny. Bert left quietly, packed up his RV and disappeared one morning without a word. I hadn't seen him since. A part of me hoped he'd learned something. Another part suspected he was just done being dragged into someone else's mess. He had become a symbol in the story, but underneath all the absurdity was just a man who trusted the wrong person too many times. I didn't hate him. In some ways, I pitied him. Karen's war had used him as a foot soldier, and like most foot soldiers in petty wars, he got left behind. The HOA officially retired Karen's bylaws. The new ones focused on clarity, community consent, and external verification. It turned out that for all her bluster, Karen had operated mostly through confusion and intimidation. She banked on people not reading fine print or not wanting to argue. Once her smoke cleared, what remained was the truth. Nobody had really agreed with her. They had just stayed quiet. And now that quiet was gone, replaced by cautious optimism, you could feel it at every meeting, every backyard cookout, every friendly wave across fences. As for me, I kept improving the dock. It became more than a personal sanctuary, it became a community symbol. Kids started asking if they could fish off it on weekends. Retirees came by during sunset to watch the water glow. Couples brought folding chairs and soft music. I didn't gate it. I didn't restrict it. I just asked for respect, and funny enough, people gave it. Maybe it was the notoriety. Maybe it was the way I handled it. Or maybe it was because, deep down, we all knew that space only becomes sacred when someone tries to take it away. I did one last thing to put the saga to bed. One quiet Saturday afternoon, I added a small brass plaque to the edge of the dock. It read simply, "Property of Tyler. Moved once. Never again." I didn't tell anyone. But over the weeks people noticed. Some laughed. Some nodded. A few snapped pictures. It wasn't revenge. It was closure. Looking back, I think the strangest part of it all was how close I came to doing nothing. That first day, when I saw Bert on the dock, I could have just yelled and let it go. Could have called the HOA, written an angry letter, stewed in my own frustration like so many people do. But I didn't. I acted. Not out of rage, but out of a need to stand firm. Karen wasn't the first entitled neighbor, and she won't be the last. But what matters isn't how loud people like her are. What matters is how clearly you say no. And how calmly you hold your ground, floating or otherwise. Now, every time I sit out there with a cup of coffee or a book or nothing at all, I feel it. That stubborn peace. Protected. Respected. It's not just wood and bolt. It's a lesson nailed into the water. A reminder that you don't need to scream to be heard. You don't need to fight to win. Sometimes, all it takes is knowing what belongs to you, holding on to it, and when the moment's right, letting the world watch you tow away the nonsense with a smile.